Welcome to Content with Character, the weekly podcast that'll give you the momentum you need to create content with more ease, clarity, and laughter. I'm your host, content copywriter Emily Aborn, and I'm all about unconventional marketing approaches. I believe in your big ideas, and I'm excited to help you share them in a way that's distinctly you. What's the difference between talking about ourselves and bragging about ourselves? Does everyone else feel awkward in networking situations, or is that just me? And when you're on a podcast or introducing yourself from the stage, how do you avoid not sharing your entire life story, but still make sure to include all the highlights? You're going to want to listen to this episode because we're going to get into how to talk about ourselves verbally. You can take these ideas and apply them to just about anywhere you need to use your voice and speak up. Hi, welcome back. I wanted to start today's episode off with a question for you. What are you working on right now? Projects, ideas. What are you focusing on, spending your creative energy on? What are you working on right now? And you do not have to pause the podcast and write that question down or anything. I mean, not saying you even would, but you don't have to because I'm going to bring it back up for you at the end and tell you why I asked in the first place. I absolutely love the question. And if you are a listener of the She Built This podcast, in addition to this one, you may have heard last week's guest, Terry Trespicio, a return guest, listener favorite, share that's how she likes to talk about herself, as well as ask others about themselves in networking settings. She goes on to say, it's a far more interesting question, and I agree with this, than simply, what do you do? So keep that question in mind, and as I said, I will bring it back up in the end of the episode. And if you hear anything weird in today's recording, it's because my husband is out there, and what he is working on is, well, I actually have no idea, but he's using lots and lots of tools, and they make lots and lots of noise. So on that note, speaking of tools and noise, let's dive into the nuts and bolts of the episode. But before we do, I want to share who I am really quick, talk about myself, if you will, for 15 seconds or less, because I want to be sure that if this is your first time listening, that we are on the same page here and we get a chance to make a connection. I also want to thank you for checking out the podcast and listening, and I hope you love it. I hope you get a lot of value in today's episode, and then go back and binge all the others and follow, subscribe, stick around, be a loyal listener, aka new friend. I'm Emily Aborn. I'm a content copywriter, podcast host of this podcast, as well as the She Built This podcast. And let's see, to answer my own question, right now I'm working on a super top secret project / idea, which you'll find out about soon enough, sorting out my schedule for kind of the last 4 months of the year here. I have a lot of speaking opportunities and conferences I'm going to, and I'm also in the process of writing website copy for a coach who works with women ADHDers, and I'm about to kick off with a new interior designer for her website copy. Actually, that is happening today. So, I'm also working on loving on my dog, Clyde, my husband, Jason, and being around and present for my family and my friends and my life instead of being fixated on the past or future. It's really a lovely new modus operandi. Okay, so that is me. That is what I do, framed through that lens of what I am working on right now, what I am excited about right now. I also want to just take 1 second and give a giant thank you to Positively Lisa, who wrote me a awesome 5-star review this week. I happen to know Lisa is Lisa Zarotny, who she is the host of the Positively Living podcast. And I'll make sure there's a link to that in the show notes. If you haven't ever listened to it or heard of it, you probably would love it if you love this show. Lisa says, character matters and Emily has it. I've been a fan of Emily's for a while. I've had her on my podcast multiple times as a guest to discuss content and visibility, and I also hired her to help me with content and would search out her advice because she's genuine, heartfelt, and effective. I was so excited when she began this podcast because that means we all get her advice and the benefit of her character. So big thanks to Lisa. Those are some extremely kind words. Lisa and I did, she's not lying, we had so much fun doing like a done with you style in her content. And I have also collaborated with her as a fellow podcaster and enjoyed it every single second of the way. So on that note, I also want to invite you to write me a review, give me a 5-star rating, of course, and share what you love about the episodes, because then I know what to keep on doing, and your reviews help me to grow the show. Okay, on to the topic du jour. Today's topic came up because, well, we have been talking a lot about how to write about ourselves. Everything from our bios to social media posts, introducing yourself, to the about pages on our website, which all of those things are things that I focused on in the last couple of episodes. So if you missed them, I'll make sure that those links are in the show notes. It's been kind of like a little mini series, if you will, all about how to talk about yourself. Share about yourself, write about yourself. But we have left something important out of the conversation, because it is one thing to write about yourself and get it all out in a clear, concise way and written form, especially for those of us who love to write, and that is how we process is through writing. That's me. Sometimes I don't know what I think until I start writing, and I don't know what I feel about what I think until I start writing. So for some people, written form is truly like how you process and get some clarity on whatever you're saying. But when we're talking about ourselves, when we're actually using our voice to talk about ourselves, it can be an entirely different story. It can be a different story when we have to introduce ourselves using our voices, whether that be at a speaking engagement, as a guest on a podcast interview, or in a networking setting. So, because it's really important, and it is quite a bit different, I think, than writing about yourself, today I wanted to be sure I didn't leave that big topic hanging out there without touching on it. And so we're going to get into each of those three things and hopefully be very concise and brief with each. And then don't forget that question I asked you at the beginning, because we're going to bring it back, and you can actually even use that concept to apply to your written stuff too. I love wrapping things in bows, and so I will wrap it all in a bow at the end. Okay, so to kick us off, I say we start with speaking engagements. People are speaking in person more nowadays, and there are online opportunities as well. So I'm going to start with online, because I don't know about you, but I've done a lot of online workshops and attended conferences, and like all from my desk over the past 3 years. And I've also done lots of speaking at them too, for other organizations, as well as like workshops and things like that I've hosted for myself, events and stuff. So here's what I've seen many, many times. A lot of people hop onto these calls and they just dive straight into introducing themselves. So they basically kick off their presentation with an introduction. And now what I see happening is that the audience either sort of zones out for the entire first 2 minutes because they know that the person is introducing themselves and they can do one last thing, or respond to one more email before the workshop starts, or keep their camera off and like shovel breakfast into their mouth for one, before they have to turn their camera on. And often they are not listening to that introduction in its entirety, or maybe even tuning it out. And I don't want that to happen to you. So the other thing I see is that this just becomes, in some cases, a long list of qualifications, or a slide of qualifications and bullet points and experience by the presenter. And that is not, in my personal opinion, this is truly just my opinion, but I don't think that is the way to kick yourself off on a presentation with a very engaging start. Again, I'm not saying what I do is right, but I'm going to offer you another way, an alternative. I like to start online speaking engagements, and soon in-person engagements, because I have a few of those coming up this fall. I like to start online speaking engagements with a question, or maybe a little bit of a engagement hypothesis, or even kind of like a statistic. So I might do that to start the presentation off. And then I like to give them a few snippets of what we're going to talk about in the presentation, in the workshop. Give them kind of like the bullet points, if you will, so they know where I'm about to take them. Not like, you will learn today, blah, 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 but more of like, hey, this is what I often hear as questions and frustrations around this topic. So today we're going to actually address XYZ out of these struggles. I also like to let people know that there will be questions and answers at the end. So I always say, like, if you have a question, jot it down or put it in the chat and we'll open up questions at the end. Or if it's relevant, of course, tell them that it's an open discussion. They can just raise their hand and pop in. Basically, the point there is to map out the layout, give people the way that it's going to go right up front, because it kind of just helps them to feel settled in, relaxed, like you're sort of like they want to pay attention to those details of what the presentation involves and what they can kind of expect as their participation. So in that vein, if you want people to participate, if you want people to chime in or, ask questions as you go, make sure to let them know. Then I say, okay, before we get started, I do want to introduce myself and invite you to connect with me later, either by email or online. I will make sure that that information is for you on the last slide, or if I'm not using slides, I would say I will make sure you have that information at the chat before we wrap up. So then, typically, if I'm using slides, I will put up a slide with probably a cute picture of my dog. Yes, I am using my dog to introduce myself because they can see my face, right? Like they can see me, the presenter. They don't need another picture. They don't need a headshot of me, but I like to share something that I actually love about my life, like one of my favorite parts of my life. So I might put this cute picture up of my dog and say like about me or my story. And I share my story or about me as it is relevant to the topic at hand. So for example, if I'm talking about podcasting versus blogging, which is a workshop I offer, I will share how I do both. So I might say, I have 2 podcasts. I write a regular blog. I might share that I'm a content copywriter in that instance. If I'm doing a content specific workshop, I might share the actual ways in which I create content. And I will kind of like use my story to be a part of that. So in the podcasting example, for instance, I might share how I got started, like what got me excited to start a podcast, maybe what my first ever podcast that I listened to was, which was Serial in 2014 when my husband and I were on a road trip. So I might share like what my first podcast was that I listened to, how I got started, how I learned to do it, et cetera, my favorite part of being a podcaster. So I'm going to introduce myself through the lens of what I'm sharing on. And personally, again, this is personally, I almost always choose some sort of like random fact. Like I'll share my appreciation for word games or Jeopardy or books. And then I open it up. So if you have access to the chat in this instance, if we're online, I would invite people to share in the chat somewhere around that commonality. Now, if I'm in person, I might say, raise your hand if you have to also play Wordle every single day to get your day started off on the right foot. And just invite people in the audience to like be engaged and be part of my introduction. So my point here, as you can probably tell, is that I want you to think of a way to make it engaging so that when you're introducing yourself, it's not just, yes, you are sharing about who you are and what you do, but you're also like bringing them in. So it's a little bit of it's instantly creating a little bit more of a conversation, more of a connection. And let me just tell you, as an audience participant, it is so entirely refreshing when somebody does that. Okay. Idea number 2 in this is if your workshop or your topic, okay, let me just actually use an example. So my other idea is to bring in what you're actually talking about in the workshop in your intro. So here's my example. So let's say I'm doing a workshop on building a bio, or like writing your bio. Like that's my actual workshop topic. I would actually talk through my own bio in a way that matches up like how I'm going to present the information. So I'll be sharing my bio, and I'll say like, this bio is kind of, I'm going to teach you to do this with your bio. So as I read mine, I might pull out little tidbits and share how we're going to talk about that today. If you were, say, I'm going to use my friend Christina Granahan here. If you were an Enneagram coach, you could actually start by sharing your Enneagram type, and then like maybe an attribute or a quirk of your type that is relevant to the workshop. You could also share how you're going to show them what it even means to say that type, and then how you're going to help them figure out what theirs is too. So now I'm talking about yourself, but through a way that's like, here's what we're about to get into and how it applies to you through my actual bio. Like it's super cool and relevant. Last example, let's say you have a unique name for your business, last idea. Sorry. Actually, no, I have two more. One other idea. Let's say you have a unique name for your business. So someone I'm thinking of is called the Badass Bookkeeper. So what if that person, as she's introducing herself, she talks about what made her a badass and how that qualifies her to help you be a badass in the talk. Again, I'm not talking about like negating your title, your education, all the fancy credentials behind your name. I'm inviting you to think creatively about how to make this more conversational and interactive so that people stay engaged and curious, even as you're introducing yourself, which is like when people tune out. And it's very exciting to get that opportunity to engage with them at that time. Another idea, last idea, I promise this time, is start with a story. Start with a story and then dive in on your introduction and how that's relevant to the story you just told, how you're going to help them today. So maybe the story is like how you learned to do what you do, or when you first discovered you needed to find out what you did to learn to do what you do. So that's something else. Okay. Now, I think that those all are great recommendations for either in person or online. You may or may not have slides, but you can still bring in that conversational, you may or may not have the chat, but you can still bring in that conversational interactive piece. One thing I do recommend is to practice. Practice and see what feels good and right for you, and then let it rip and let me know how it goes, because it can be super fun. It's fun to think of new creative ways to introduce ourselves. Oh, and last thing I just want to say and then we'll move on to podcast interviews. I'm not suggesting like don't say hi. Okay. I usually start, to be realistic, I usually start my presentation by being like, hi, everyone, I'm Emily. I will formally introduce myself in a minute, but I always like to start with a story. Or I will formally introduce myself in a minute, but first I want to share this statistic with you I read the other day, or, something like that. The other idea is and this is totally dependent on like what the setting is, but sometimes it can be really interesting to start by asking everybody else, like let's use an online example, but maybe like put in the chat who you are and why you're here, or who you are and what you're most excited to learn about today. So that's another way you could kind of like weave in your own introduction into what people are sharing. Now, in some cases, the host is going to introduce you using your bio. Like they will read the bio, the one that you wrote in last week's episode. I think it was the week before last. So in some cases, the host will introduce you using your written bio. So then you kind of get even another opportunity to really reinstill that engagement. You're like, now I am here. The party is here because they just read my bio. You all tuned out for that. So let me say it in my own words. You can also add something after your bio that gets a little smile or a laugh, like to springboard off of that being read. And if you're not just like actually like rinsing and repeating and like telling them your entire bio yet again, you remember that you can always bring it back up later in the presentation. So like I might, for example, say, as a podcaster, I blah, 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 blah. As a writer, I et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like I'm still reminding them later on in the presentation of what I do. Okay. Let's move on to podcast interviews as promised. Podcast interviews. First of all, congratulations on getting the podcast interview. The hard part is like truly over. Well, mostly, till you have to share it. That's another hard part. Some podcasters will send you questions ahead of time, and they will clue you in as to like what they'll be asking during the interview. But I wouldn't necessarily expect this, because I think that like 90% of the time, they just don't. They don't send you the questions ahead of time, which is fine. Like, we don't need the questions ahead of time. We think on our feet, right? But anyway, if they do send you the questions ahead of time, look them over. See how they are going to ask you to introduce yourself. Here's what I mean, because they do this in different ways. We all do this in different ways. Often they will like read your bio before you get on, and they'll do that in their setup, or they may read it while you're sitting there, and they truly do read it. Although I had an amazing interview with Melissa Snow of the Your Relationship With podcast, and she was so amazing at making even the bio sound just incredibly conversational. Like, she was interacting with my bio as she was reading it, and I try to do that with some of my guests too. But anyway, let's just imagine they're just kind of like sitting it, reading there in front of you, like the bio you wrote from that episode 2 weeks ago. And if you didn't listen to that episode, I know I keep referring to it. I will include it in the show notes. It's called How to Write About Yourself. Okay, so you're back in the podcast interview setting. You read what they sent you, and the questions typically look like something like this. And there's like three major ones, actually. So tell us more about who you are and what you do. Tell us the story of what brought you to do what you do today. Tell us more about you and who you help. Okay, so those are like the three I get the most. And I'm sure that there are some variations in there, but those are like the major players. So this is your moment. This is the moment for you, but also you and the host, because you get to create this connection point here and open it up as a conversation. And you get to create a connection point with the listeners. So what I often see here at this point is that people begin to go on a really, really rambly road. All the things in their life that brought them to what they do, like the entire breadcrumb trail. And we're back at age 5. Also, as I share on this specific podcast interviews, like, I'm right here with you. My sleeves are rolled up alongside you, and I'm working on this in live time with you on podcast interviews that I'm on, because I can be found going back to my childhood. And sometimes someone needs to like drag me back. Bring me back, Emily. Bring me back. Keep it relevant. Like, so sometimes what I hear is, well, I was born in then I did this job, then I quit this job, then I opened my business, then I realized it wasn't the business for me, then I opened the business I have now, then I changed my niche 3 times, and here we are today, and how I help today is this way, and this way, and this way, and that way, and this way, and this way, and this way, and I'm also doing this, and I also do this, and sometimes I do this, and I have a dog. So see what I mean? Like, by this time, the host is like, okay. If they're a good host, they're going to have some great questions to pull out of your entire life story. But I just don't love it as a way to like stand out as a guest. Like, it's not super duper interesting to most listeners. So a suggestion is to think about your story as it is relevant to today's topic, the topic that you are being asked to speak on their podcast. So like I said, I was recently on Melissa Snow's Your Relationship With podcast. Our topic was your relationship with curiosity marketing. Now, Melissa had told me that she was going to read my bio before I joined in her setup. And when we were live on air, she asked me about myself, and she kind of said something along the lines of like, so what do you do and who do you work with? Like, how did you get into learning about curiosity in our content and marketing? And so, I was tempted. I wanted to go back to age 6, but I stopped myself, and I replied essentially how I was just like super, super curious about curiosity one month. I said I was like taking an SEO course. In the SEO course, we focused on various topics for our blogs and podcasts, and one of my topics was curiosity. And through learning about curiosity, through writing about curiosity, I literally just followed my curiosity. And then I started learning about its power in our content and visibility efforts. So now, caveat this, I'm not saying this is like some wildly amazing response, but what it was concise, short, sweet. It allowed me to share a little bit more about what I do in a storytelling way. And it brought me back to what we were specifically talking about that day. Because I definitely could have gone into how I was like a reader since I was a kid, have always been curious, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so another example or another idea is to relate to the host in some way or to the listener. So for some examples, I know from listening to you that you're a great writer and podcaster, and I am too. I do it in this very specific way for these very specific people. Or I know from binging your show that your listeners are super curious about nutrition. And that is why I'm so excited to chat with you, because I've been studying the world of nutrition since I could read the back of a cereal box. Or, just bring something that you both have in common into the conversation. Like, oh my gosh, I love that we're both XYZ. And then you kind of springboard into your bio. Now, okay, one thing, or springboard into talking about yourself and what you do. One thing I would recommend is to just keep your intro short and sweet to start. Like keep that part where you're telling your bit at the beginning a little bit short and sweet to start. Now, here's why. I actually have 3 reasons why to keep it short and sweet. A, the host is going to ask you more questions because as you're sharing, they're going to get more curious, and they also know where they kind of want the conversation to go. So they're going to ask questions based on what you shared and how they kind of want that conversation to go. B, you can also use the opportunity to say, like, if you want to read my full bio, it's on my website. You can connect with me on Instagram. You can listen to my podcast, et cetera, et cetera. So you could say that during your intro, if you're allowed. Make sure the host lets you. Or you could also say that at the end of your chat together. But C, you're going to weave in other aspects of your story. You're going to weave in pieces of your bio throughout the interview as you go through the topic. So you don't need to say every single thing about your life story from the get-go. Say the relevant pieces and keep it short and sweet at the beginning, because they will feed their curiosity and dive in more on what you share if they're a good podcast host. One thing I loved was a recent guest of mine, Adam Adams. He asked me before we hit record, he asked me who my listeners were. And I think that's a really good thing to do as a podcast guest. Who are your listeners? So when I told him who my listeners were, he was able to introduce himself by bringing in those people into his introduction. So when he introduced himself, he brought in that reference from our pre-recorded chat and talked about how he specifically helped that type of person. So for example, like if I were a bookkeeper and I was on a real estate podcast, I might say, as I'm introducing myself, I know your listeners are mostly real estate agents or brokers. And let me just tell you, as a bookkeeper for over 20 years and a former realtor myself, I have seen some scary books from real estate agents, let me tell you. So I think what we're going to talk about today is going to be super relevant and help your people so much. Add in another little sprinkle of, what makes your bio so special if you want. But again, practice a little bit with what feels right for you. Listen to their show. See how they open up that conversation with their guests. Like that's a really big clue for you on how to make that connection point. You can just listen to how they usually introduce their guests. Like what questions do they usually ask to kick off the conversation? And then also pay attention to what other guests do in their introductions that make you lean in or that make you kind of be like, ugh, that was too much. That was too much. So listen to any of the podcasts, pay attention to how they're introducing themselves too and what you love and also what you don't love. All right, 2 quick things to avoid on podcast interviews specifically. Number 1, avoid starting with, oh my God, this one. Okay. Avoid starting with, where to start. Like, no offense to anybody that does that, because I know for sure I have done it too, but it is super overused. Like the amount of times I hear it in podcast guests and I'm like, oh my God, like you knew this question was coming. We all knew it was coming. So it is a little overused. And I think the other thing is I think that it makes the listener sort of like brace themselves for like a potentially incoming saga of your entire life story. So you can just don't say that. You don't need to say where to start. Just dive into the story. start with the story, start with telling them about yourself, like drop them right in. Okay. Just drop them right in. Cut to the chase. Number 2, avoid. I would say this might be controversial, but I would avoid going for a quippy, cute title or a tagline in your introduction on a podcast interview specifically, because I think that sometimes it doesn't always sound as good as it reads. So it might look like truly lovely on your business card and on your website, but it might not sound as good. So I'll use myself for example. Like I would feel weird. I think I would feel weird saying, hello, thanks so much for having me. I'm Emily Aborn, as you mentioned. I'm a content copywriter who helps women entrepreneurs bring their messages to life. It just sounds kind of cheesy and practiced and rehearsed. And instantly, when a listener hears something that is cheesy, practiced, rehearsed, potentially salesy, it is going to lessen the amount of trust that they have in you. So just a little word to the wise, you may not want to go for quippy, cute, something like that. Or just really anything that isn't super clear. Like it just kind of creates this like, okay, what exactly is that? Can you please tell me more? Like, what does that mean to bring your message to life? Kind of doesn't give them any place to go. So save the one-liners for your business card and remember that this is more of a conversation. Like you want to invite curiosity in what you're sharing. Okay, lastly, the first part of this podcast episode was all in one breath. So this is breath number 2. Lastly, networking settings. Now, whether the networking setting is 1-to-1, 2-to-1, a group, networking settings can be awkward for some people when it comes to introducing ourselves. And I feel like similarly to like that business card kind of vibe or that like introduction in a podcast, like there is pressure to have this like quippy one-liner or like some tagline elevator pitch kind of intro. But we don't need to do that. Like, especially people in BNI, I found they're practiced in doing this like quippy 45-second sort of like infomercial. But I don't think that always translates naturally to like a networking setting. So what if instead we just talk about ourselves and our businesses like we're humans? Like it's a little more human. And we're not trying to like cram down our message down people's throat before they can interrupt us. Like that's not the vibe here, right? Let's give them a calming, soothing experience and create a conversation. Like it's like a back and forth. If you didn't get your entire bio or your whole title out, like in the first, if you didn't get it out before they asked you another question, it's okay. You can always come back to it later. So you don't need to have like a tagline or an elevator pitch or a 45-second like let's get off to the races kind of thing. So here's a couple of ideas. I have 3 for you to take the pressure off from that and what you might try instead. So let's pretend you're at a networking event. Doesn't matter if it's virtual, in person, one-on-one, doesn't matter. And somebody asks you, so what do you do? So idea number 1, I love the idea of opening up with something that makes people curious when you give your reply. So for example, and it's so simple, like it is so incredibly simple. If I just say I'm a writer and a podcaster, people tend to ask me follow-up questions. If I say I'm a content copywriter, some people don't know what that means. And people tend not to ask me a follow-up question. They're like, okay, fair enough. Like, that's interesting. That's great. I'm not exactly sure why the former is so much more interesting than the latter, but I would just have to say it's because of the simplicity and the vagueness of it, but still being super, super concrete. And I think that if the roles were reversed, I agree. I do the same thing. If someone says they're a painter, I'm like, ooh, home or art. If someone says they're a writer, if I say I'm a writer, people will ask me like, what do I write? If I say I'm a podcaster, oh, what's your podcast about? So you could do this depending on your personality. Like, you could even be funny about it if you want. I'm thinking of like a banker, like, I count money all day. If you're a travel agent, like, well, I wear Mickey Mouse ears most days when I leave my house. But you can also just think about a piece of your business that is really simple and does make people more curious, which really in many cases, like I said, it just comes down to like simplifying your title and not trying to reel them in with this like elevator pitch, this practiced elevator pitch or quippy tagline, which in many cases honestly, if you say it verbally in a networking setting, it just kind of leaves people like, okay then. Well, okay, no further questions. Thank you. All right, idea number 2. Resist the urge to diminish what you do. What do I mean by this? Don't start with, oh, I'm just a, or, oh, I'm actually a. Like, those are things that kind of diminish what we do, the significance of what we do, the significance of who we are, the significance. It just definitely leave the butts out of it for sure. I don't know why you would have any of those there in the first place, but just in case, leave those out. You don't need to start with, oh, I'm just a. Just say what you do. Say it confidently, say it clearly, and say it simply. With women especially, I've seen this time and time again. And this is so fascinating. And I'm sure I've done this myself too. I've seen time and time again where their actual voices get quieter when they tell you what they do. They audibly decrease the volume to tell you in practically a whisper that they're a coach or an author or a designer. No, we want to be saying this like loud and proud and memorably. So we have to assume, because the other person asked, they did ask, assume that the other person is interested and that they want to know more. And you're not being braggadocious or ego-driven, like you're not taking up space or air or otherwise. They asked you, and you are here to meet people, and you also need to talk about yourself. And like I said, I am talking to myself on that one too, because I know for sure that I've done that. Okay, last idea. Idea number 3 is to answer back with what you're working on right now or what you're excited about right now. Remember, we started the episode with that. Well, right now, I'm working on writing website copy for an interior designer. Right now, I'm excited because I'm just about to launch a new small group on marketing and visibility starting in the fall. That answering in that way also invites follow-up questions, and make sure to reciprocate that. So you might say like, well, so what are you working on right now? What are you excited about right now? What do you got your hands in at work right now? Lastly, this is going to be easier said than done, but this is just like a general networking rule. Bring an element of curiosity, not rule, suggestion. Bring an element of curiosity to the people that you're meeting to. Because if you're just sitting there thinking about what you're going to say, how you're going to introduce yourself, you will probably miss out on the entire point of networking, which is to build relationships, have conversations, and make connections. And I would say that this goes actually for probably all of the ways we've discussed in this episode so far. It's just like, it's not all about you. It's actually about the fact that you're having a conversation and you're exchanging with other people. How many times do I say that about literally everything that we share, right? It's a bridge. It is a two-way street. Julie Brown, author of This Shit Works, gives an incredible example of this in her book. She says what she often sees is people fixating on their own actual name. They think about how they are going to actually say their name, and they rehearse it mentally again and again and again and again. Like, okay, Emily Aborn, Emily Aborn, Emily Aborn. And when they focus so much on that when they're introducing themselves that they actually miss the other person's name. Never mind what the other person does, never mind the actual title of the other person, they miss the name. So ever since I read that in her book, I always try really hard to remember that. Like, I know my name, okay? I know my name when I'm meeting somebody new. I need to know theirs. And this is actually just like a total random pro tip. Maybe it doesn't help you at all. But one thing that I found I need to do post still sort of here COVID is I need to actually ask people for first and last names. So if someone tells me their first name, I will usually say, can you share your first and last name with me? Because it will help me to make a little bit more of a concrete word picture and also put it to your face. So, and then I might say some joke like, I know I'm a weirdo and I still would love to hear your first and last name. Something like that. Like, I'm very awkward and I just own it. Okay. Couple other random little tips. Remember, once they share who they are and what you do, let's say they went first, okay? You can then, your curiosity question could be like, oh, that's interesting. What are you working on right now? Oh, that's interesting. What does a day in the life of that look like? Oh, wow. So what kind of clients do you like to work with? Remember, curiosity, being interested in other people, it makes you the most interesting person in the room. It makes you super fascinating. So go with that. Also, most people, I'd say, no, I'm not going to say most people. Lots of people claim to feel awkward in social settings. So that's another thing I just kind of like to remember and own and keep in the back of my mind. Like, I'm not the only awkward on here. We're all out there doing this like awkward weirdos and humans. Quite frankly, no one has it all figured out. And I'm going to give you just like a funny story because I'm ready to wrap us up here, but funny story just to make you laugh. I bumped into someone at the grocery store who I've actually like dog sat for these people. I know his wife from like, oh my gosh, like 13 years ago, and a roommate I lived with around here. So anyway, like I've been in their home. I've taken care of their dog. I've slept in their beds. Like I know these people, okay? They live in our town. I know them. So I saw him at the grocery store, the husband, and I smiled and I waved and I said hi. And then we just kind of like kept on going our separate little ways. You know, I put my walnuts in the bag and like my chocolate and my lemon juice and stuff. And he went his way and bought toilet paper or whatever. On my way home after that encounter, I started overthinking and worrying. I was like, oh my gosh, did he think that I didn't know his name because I didn't say, hi, Tim? I just said hi. And so I was like, did he think that I didn't know who he was? Did he think that I didn't know that I was the one that dog sat for them and I didn't know his wife and I wasn't friends with his wife? And blah, blah, blah. Like my brain was just like going for it. So a month later, I see him in the grocery store again. Different aisle, different day, same store. And this time I said, hey, Tim, how's it going? Good to see you. How's your wife? Da-da-da-da. You know, yada, yada. Okay, so send my best rose. Then we start walking away and going opposite directions. Me probably going to buy almonds instead of walnuts this time. Him probably going to buy paper towels instead of toilet paper. But no, we start going opposite directions. I'm not done here. Emily is not done here. Oh my God, you guys, I'm so bad. I backed up my cart. I like backed it up. Like I like stepped backwards with my cart and I awkwardly am like next to him again. And I make eye contact and I just like say, also, just so you know, I knew your name was Tim last time. I thought about it afterwards and I had just said hi and I didn't want you to think I didn't know your name because I didn't call you by name. And he just looks at me like, okay, smiles, nods. He's like, back away from the lady in the yam aisle, back away. And honestly, I don't even know if he knows my name. Like, I'm friends with his wife. I know his wife. So he probably didn't. He never thought twice about it. I guarantee you. Anyway, fortunately, he's like a therapist or something or a psychologist or something. I feel like he understood what I was trying to say in my own unique Emily way. But here is my point. We're all weird. Like, we're all quirky and awkward and feel funny sometimes in our own skin. So the faster we can just embrace that, like in networking settings, then you get to just like have freedom to be the person you are, you know, and then you get to be the person to help make people feel more at ease and more comfortable. Because when you say the stuff that makes them feel more normal than you, well, then you are like me and I'm sorry, but also it's helpful. It's helpful to be the person that says the stuff that makes other people feel normal. Okay, to wrap up, how do you know when you are talking about yourself versus when it crosses the line and you begin bragging about yourself? Now, I want to tell you, I had every intention of including the answer to that question in today's episode, but I just kept on going. So we're going to address it in next week's episode. But today I want to encourage you with the final wrap up. If you are the type to overthink talking about yourself, focus on just being the real deal you, right? Ask questions, be interested in others, bring other people into the conversation. Don't be afraid to bring in pieces of your personality and the things that make you you outside the business suit, because that is really how you are going to make that genuine connection with other people. And have fun, be different, try something new, experiment, practice, see how it goes. Call me if it doesn't work out. Anyway, I want to leave you with your little action item or a challenge, if you will. And no, it does not go write an elevator pitch, because I basically just spent an entire episode telling you how overplayed I think elevator pitches are. I want to bring back my question for you from the beginning. What are you working on right now? And I want you to answer it for yourself. What projects, ideas, where are you focusing? Where are you spending your creative energy? What are you working on right now? What's exciting you? What's exciting for you? What are you going to create next? And I would love for you to do a post, do a reel. It could be written or spoken. Include it in your next introduction to somebody and answer that question as you do and see how it goes. And if you post it on social media, please tag me so I can see it. Okay, that's it for today. Next week, like I said, we're going to talk about how to get others to talk about yourself. We're going to wrap up this whole talking about and writing about series with how to get your clients, listeners, and fans to talk about you, and how to actually use that in your own visibility and marketing. So I will chat with you then. And in the meantime, I would love to invite you to talk about me and share this episode with somebody else in your life, because chances are they need the information too. And I would love your help spreading the word about the show. I will chat with you next week, and thank you so much for being here. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Content with Character. If you loved the episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast, rate, review, and share it with someone else you know it could help. For more content and visibility tips, visit my blog at emilyaborn.com, and be sure to connect with me on Instagram at emilyaborn. I'd love to hear how this inspired you to take action.